Welcome to the WW2 Archives, where we unlock the classified files of World War II and examine the mechanisms of history that reveal patterns in our present. January 20th, 1942. 15 Nazi officials gather at a lakeside villa in Wannsee, a suburb of Berlin. Over the next 90 minutes, they will coordinate what they call the final solution to the Jewish question, the systematic murder of every Jew in Europe. The meeting is chaired by Reinhard Heydrich, second in command of the SS. Adolf Eichmann takes meticulous minutes, producing a 15-page protocol that survives the war and becomes crucial evidence at Nuremberg. But here's what makes this document extraordinary. Nowhere in those 15 pages does it use the words kill, murder, or exterminate. Instead, it speaks of evacuation to the east, natural reduction through labor, and appropriate treatment. This pattern of written absence defines the Holocaust documentation at the highest levels. For 75 years, historians have searched for one specific document, a signed order from Adolf Hitler commanding the Holocaust. They've combed through millions of captured Nazi files, interrogated hundreds of perpetrators, analyzed thousands of bureaucratic records. The search has been exhaustive, systematic, and ultimately unsuccessful. The document doesn't exist. This creates three mysteries that this investigation will solve. First, how was history's most systematically documented genocide carried out without written orders from its architect? Second, what does this absence reveal about how bureaucratic evil operates? And third, why does understanding this mechanism matter urgently today? The answer to the question, did Hitler order the Holocaust, is unequivocally yes. The evidence is overwhelming, the guilt is absolute, the proof is ironclad. But the absence of that one signed document reveals something more important than any signature ever could. It reveals how institutions commit atrocities while maintaining plausible deniability, how bureaucracies enable genocide through distributed responsibility, and how the same patterns operate in modern systems today. By the end of this investigation, you'll understand why the document that doesn't exist is the most damning evidence of all. And you'll be able to recognize the warning signs when similar mechanisms emerge in contemporary institutions, because they are emerging, right now, hiding behind the same techniques Hitler perfected: euphemistic language, verbal-only authorization, anticipatory radicalization, and distributed moral responsibility. This is the secret history of how Hitler ordered the Holocaust without writing it down, and what that teaches us about recognizing institutional evil before it kills. The document that doesn't exist. The prosecutorial team at Nuremberg faced a problem that threatened their entire case. They had mountains of evidence documenting Nazi crimes: camp records, railway schedules, supply requisitions, death statistics, witness testimonies, physical evidence from liberation. What they didn't have was the one document that would make everything simpler: a signed order from Adolf Hitler commanding the Holocaust. Robert Jackson, the American chief prosecutor, understood the challenge. In his opening statement on November 21, 1945, he addressed it directly. He said, "The case we present is not built on a single order or a smoking gun document. It is built on a pattern of action so consistent, so systematic, so thoroughly coordinated across multiple agencies and territories, that it proves beyond doubt the existence of a criminal conspiracy at the highest levels of the Nazi state." This wasn't prosecutorial strategy. It was historical reality. Despite the Nazi regime's obsessive documentation of nearly everything else, despite filing systems that tracked individual prisoners through multiple camps, despite railway bureaucrats who scheduled trains with Germanic precision, despite accountants who inventoried stolen property down to the last gold tooth, despite all this meticulous record-keeping, no document exists where Hitler explicitly orders the final solution. This absence has consequences. Holocaust deniers exploit this gap relentlessly. Their primary argument goes like this: if Hitler ordered the Holocaust, show us his signature. Show us the document. Without it, how can you prove he knew, much less commanded? This logic deliberately confuses absence of one specific document with absence of evidence generally. It's a confusion that collapses under scrutiny, but persists because it sounds superficially reasonable. Let's be absolutely clear. The absence of Hitler's signed order on Holocaust does not create reasonable doubt about his responsibility. What it creates is a window into understanding how bureaucratic genocide operates, how leaders maintain plausible deniability, and how institutional evil can be both systematic and deliberately undocumented. So what evidence actually exists? The answer, An overwhelming convergence from multiple independent sources, each corroborating the others, together building an ironclad case that satisfies both historical and legal standards of proof. The first category of evidence is Hitler's public threats. On January 30, 1939, Hitler addressed the Reichstag, the German parliament, in a speech broadcast across Germany and reported internationally. Midway through discussing foreign policy, he made what he called a prophecy. He said, "If international finance jury inside and outside Europe should succeed in plunging the nations once more into a world war, the result will not be the Bolshevization of the earth, and thereby the victory of Jewry, but the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe." This wasn't casual rhetoric. Hitler returned to this prophecy repeatedly throughout the war. Historians have documented at least 10 major speeches where he referenced it, claimed to be fulfilling it, reminded audiences that he had predicted it. This pattern of repetition transformed a conditional threat into a stated policy objective, a prophecy into a permission structure that subordinates understood as authorization. The second category of evidence comes from Goebbels' diary. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister and one of his closest confidants, kept detailed diaries throughout the Nazi period. These diaries, preserved on glass plates and discovered in 1945, contain over 100 references to Hitler discussing the Jewish question, the Nazi euphemism for their policies toward Jews. The entries become increasingly explicit as the war progresses. On December 12, 1941, the day after Hitler declared war on the United States, Goebbels wrote, "Regarding the Jewish question, the Führer is determined to make a clean sweep." He prophesied to the Jews that if they were to cause another world war, they would experience their own annihilation. This was not an empty phrase. The world war is here. The annihilation of Jewry must be the necessary consequence. On March 27, 1942, as deportations to death camps were accelerating, Goebbels recorded, "The procedure is pretty barbaric and not to be described more definitely. Not much will remain of the Jews. On the whole, it can be said that about 60% of them will have to be liquidated, whereas only 40% can be used for forced labor. The Führer is the unswerving champion and spokesman of a radical solution." These are not isolated entries. They represent a consistent pattern. Hitler discussed the final solution with Goebbels regularly, always verbally, always in terms that made his intentions absolutely clear. The third category is witness testimonies. When Allied forces captured senior Nazi officials, interrogations revealed remarkable consistency. Rudolf Haas, commandant of Auschwitz, testified at Nuremberg. "In the summer of 1941, I was summoned to Berlin to Reichsführer SS Himmler to receive personal orders. He told me something to the effect, I do not remember the exact words, that the Führer had given the order for the final solution of the Jewish question. We, the SS, must carry out that order. If it is not carried out now, then the Jews will later on destroy the German people." Adolf Eichmann, who organized the deportation of millions to death camps, testified during his 1961 trial in Jerusalem. "The orders for the physical extermination of the Jews came from Himmler. Himmler informed me that he had received this order directly from the Führer, and that the Führer had charged the SS with carrying out this extermination program." Dozens of other SS officers, camp commandants, and Nazi officials gave similar accounts. The pattern is consistent. Everyone claims they received the Führer's order through their immediate superior, always verbally, never in writing. The fourth category of evidence is the Wannsee Protocol. The document from that January 1942 meeting is perhaps the most famous Holocaust document precisely because it's one of the few that survived. But reading it reveals the systematic use of euphemism. The protocol speaks of evacuation of the Jews to the east, and notes that in the course of the final solution, the Jews should be brought under appropriate direction in a suitable manner to the east for labor utilization. In large labor columns, with separation of the sexes, the Jews capable of work will be led into these areas and employed in road building, in which task undoubtedly a large part will fall through natural reduction. Translation: work them to death, then kill the survivors. The protocol never explicitly says this, but Heydrich's introductory remarks note that he's been entrusted with the preparation of the final solution of the European Jewish question, and that he's received authorization from the Führer for this task. No such authorization document exists. This pattern repeats throughout the Nazi bureaucracy, references to authorization from above, euphemistic language about what's actually being authorized, and an absolute absence of written orders explicitly commanding murder. So how do historians prove Hitler's responsibility without a smoking gun document? They use what's called cumulative proof methodology, a named pattern in historical scholarship. No single piece of evidence is conclusive, but taken together, the convergence from independent sources proves the case beyond reasonable doubt. Think of it like a fire investigator examining a burned building. No single piece of evidence proves arson, but together accelerant traces, disabled sprinklers, removed documents, insurance policy, prior threats, the cumulative evidence becomes overwhelming. That's how Holocaust evidence works. The legal and historical methodology rests on principles accepted in courts worldwide. Conspiracy can be proven through circumstantial evidence, verbal agreements are legally binding, and patterns of coordinated action prove coordination, even without signed contracts. Consider how prosecutors convict organized crime leaders. Don Corleone doesn't write memos saying, "Kill this person." He communicates verbally to his capo, who communicates to soldiers. When the hitman is caught and testifies, "I was ordered by the family," that testimony, combined with patterns of communication, evidence of meetings, financial transfers, and the coordinated nature of multiple crimes, is sufficient for conviction. The evidentiary standard for proving Hitler ordered the Holocaust is actually higher than for most mafia prosecutions. We have multiple independent witnesses from different organizations testifying to the same chain of command. We have contemporary documentary evidence, Goebbels' diary, recording the verbal orders being given. We have public statements from Hitler establishing intent and creating authorization framework. We have systematic coordination of policy across multiple agencies and territories. We have physical evidence, camps, gas chambers, mass graves corroborating the testimonies. We have intercepted communications using euphemistic language that decode consistently. And we have a pattern of behavior, the T4 euthanasia program, showing Hitler learned not to sign death orders. Holocaust denial hinges on exploiting this evidentiary gap. Deniers demand the one specific document while ignoring the mountain of evidence from every other category. They insist, "Show me Hitler's signature," while dismissing testimonies as coerced, diaries as forgeries, physical evidence as post-war fabrications, and coordinated policy as bureaucratic accident. This is not legitimate historical skepticism. It's deliberate bad faith argumentation. When pressed, deniers reveal they wouldn't accept Hitler's signed order as authentic anyway, claiming it would be a forgery. The demand for impossible evidence is the tactic, not the goal. The historical consensus is absolute. Hitler ordered the Holocaust. The mechanism he used, verbal authorization within a system of anticipatory radicalization, reveals more about how bureaucratic evil operates than any signed decree ever could. Here's why this matters beyond history. Modern institutions have learned Hitler's lesson about plausible deniability through non-documentation. When corporate executives face scandals, their first defense is always, "Show me the email where I ordered that." Purdue Pharma executives, when confronted with the opioid crisis, demanded critics produce a memo where they explicitly ordered doctors to create addicts. No such memo existed, but internal testimony revealed verbal instructions, cultural incentives, and systematic pressure to maximize prescriptions. When tech platform CEOs face accusations that their algorithms radicalize users or enable genocide, they respond, "Show me where we programmed the algorithm to cause harm." No such code exists, but the cumulative effect of engagement-maximizing systems, ignored warnings, and incentive structures tells the real story. The pattern is identical to Holocaust documentation, verbal permission structures, euphemistic language, growth hacking not manipulation, engagement optimization not addiction, distributed responsibility. Each engineer made individual choices, an absence of explicit written orders commanding harm. When we accept no written order means no responsibility, we enable institutional evil to operate with impunity. The Holocaust teaches us to look beyond smoking gun documents to patterns of systematic coordination, verbal authorization chains, euphemistic language, and cumulative evidence. We began with a mystery. Why is there no document where Hitler orders the Holocaust? The answer is emerging, because the absence was the system. Hitler designed a genocide apparatus with built-in legal protection, where orders flowed verbally, where euphemism disguised murder in administrative language, where responsibility was distributed so diffusely that each participant could claim innocence. The document that doesn't exist doesn't create doubt. It reveals a sophisticated system of bureaucratic evil that modern institutions have replicated. And while historians searched archives for that missing signature, They uncovered something more important: the mechanism that allows ordinary bureaucracies, staffed by ordinary people, to commit extraordinary evil, while each participant maintains they never ordered anything wrong. Understanding how this mechanism operated in Nazi Germany is the key to recognizing it in contemporary systems before it kills again. The prophecy, permission through public threat. January 30th, 1939. The Kroll Opera House in Berlin, serving as the Reichstag chamber since the 1933 fire. Adolf Hitler stands at the podium, 6 years into his dictatorship, addressing the German parliament and, through radio broadcast, the nation and the world. The occasion is the 6th anniversary of his appointment as Chancellor. The speech covers familiar territory: his accomplishments, Germany's grievances, threats from enemies foreign and domestic. Then, partway through, he makes what he calls a prophecy. He says, "In my life, I have very often been a prophet and was generally laughed at. During my struggle for power, it was primarily the Jewish people who received with laughter my prophecies that I would someday take over the leadership of the state and thereby of the entire nation, and then, among other things, also bring the Jewish problem to its solution. I believe that this hollow laughter of Jewry in Germany has already stuck in its throat. Today I will be a prophet again. If international finance, Jewry inside and outside Europe, should succeed in plunging the nations once more into a world war, the result will not be the Bolshevization of the earth and thereby the victory of Jewry, but the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe." The audience erupts in applause. The speech is printed in German newspapers the next day. Allied intelligence services note it, file it, move on. At the time, it seems like more Hitler bombast, threatening and disturbing certainly, but not necessarily a literal declaration of genocidal intent. Looking back from 1945, with the knowledge of what actually happened, the speech transforms into something chilling, not a threat about a possible future, but an announcement of what Hitler intended to make happen. And more importantly, a statement that created a permission structure for that genocide, a public authorization that required no written orders to implement. What makes this January 1939 speech so significant for understanding how Hitler ordered the Holocaust without writing orders is what happened next. Hitler returned to this prophecy repeatedly, obsessively, throughout the war years. Historians have documented at least 10 major occasions where Hitler referenced his prophecy during the war. In September 1939, at the outbreak of war, he reminded audiences of his January prediction. In January 1941, he claimed, "My prophecy is being fulfilled." In January 1942, after mass murder had begun, he stated, "This is the fulfillment of my prophecy." In September 1942, he said, "The Jews laughed at my prophecies. They are not laughing now." In February 1943, after the Stalingrad defeat, he insisted his prophecy about Jews was being realized. The pattern reveals a deliberate strategy. By repeatedly invoking the prophecy, Hitler was doing several things simultaneously. First, he was framing genocide as inevitable consequence rather than policy choice. "I predicted this would happen if war came. War came. Therefore this must happen." This removed moral agency. It wasn't Hitler choosing to kill Jews, it was the fulfillment of a prophecy, a deterministic outcome of Jewish actions. Second, he was creating an interpretive framework for subordinates. Every Nazi official heard these speeches, understood they were meant to guide policy, and knew that implementing policies aligned with the Führer's prophecies would be rewarded. This is what historian Ian Kershaw identified as working towards the Führer, subordinates radicalizing policy to match what they perceived Hitler wanted. Third, he was providing psychological cover for perpetrators. If Hitler had prophesied this outcome, if it was historically inevitable, if Jews had caused it through their supposed actions, then individual Germans implementing the killing could tell themselves they were fulfilling prophecy rather than committing murder. This is what I'm calling prophecy as permission structure, a named pattern where leaders use public predictions to authorize private extremism without explicit commands. Joseph Goebbels understood his function perfectly. He was Hitler's interpreter, the man who decoded the Führer's prophecies into actionable policy guidance. His diary entries from late 1941 and throughout 1942 reveal this process in action. December 12, 1941, the day after Hitler declared war on the United States, Goebbels recorded, "Regarding the Jewish question, the Führer is determined to make a clean sweep." He prophesied to the Jews that if they were to cause another world war, they would experience their own annihilation. This was not an empty phrase. The world war is here, the annihilation of Jewry must be the necessary consequence. This question must be seen without any sentimentality. We are not here to have sympathy with the Jews, but only sympathy with our own German people. If the German people have now sacrificed 160,000 dead in the Eastern Campaign, then those responsible for this bloody conflict will have to pay for it with their lives. Notice the logical progression Goebbels constructs. Hitler prophesied, then war came, therefore annihilation must follow. This is consequence, not choice. Sympathy is misplaced. Perpetrators are actually achieving justice. This entry was written as mass murder was accelerating in occupied Soviet territories, as gas vans were being deployed, as the final solution was transitioning from mass shootings to industrial killing. Goebbels was providing the ideological justification, the interpretive framework that made sense of what was happening. And his source was Hitler's prophecy. On March 27, 1942, Goebbels wrote in even more explicit terms, "The procedure is pretty barbaric and not to be described more definitely. Not much will remain of the Jews. The Führer is the unswerving champion and spokesman of a radical solution, which is demanded by the way things are, and therefore appears inevitable. Thank God we now have a whole series of possibilities at our disposal in wartime, which were denied to us in peacetime. We must exploit them. The ghettos in the general government which are now becoming available can now be filled with the Jews deported from the Reich, and after a certain time the process can be repeated." Again, the prophecy framework. What's happening is inevitable, demanded by circumstances, not a choice but a necessity. And critically, Goebbels repeatedly refers to the Führer as champion of this solution, attributing authorization without claiming Hitler issued explicit orders. The brilliance, if we can use such a word for such horror, of the prophecy strategy was that it eliminated the need for orders altogether. Let me explain how this psychological mechanism operates. In a normal hierarchical organization, subordinates wait for explicit instructions. Do X. Don't do Y. Clear commands, clear obedience. But this creates bottlenecks. Everything waits for the boss's decision, and it creates paper trails that document who ordered what. Hitler's system operated differently. By making public statements about his goals and intentions, by framing them as prophecies and inevitable outcomes, he created what organizational theorists call anticipatory obedience. A named pattern where subordinates radicalize policy to match what they think the leader wants, without waiting for or requiring explicit commands. Here's how it worked in practice. A local Gauleiter, a regional party leader, hears Hitler's prophecy about Jewish annihilation. He understands this signals the Führer's will. To demonstrate his loyalty and initiative, he begins deporting Jews from his region without waiting for written orders from Berlin. When his actions are reported upward, they're approved rather than condemned, confirming he interpreted the prophecy correctly. Another official, seeing the first Gauleiter rewarded, intensifies his own anti-Jewish measures. A competition begins. Who can be most radical in working towards what the Führer obviously wants? The most extreme proposals get implemented, the most zealous officials get promoted, and the policy spiral accelerates without Hitler needing to issue a single written order. This created a system that was actually more efficient than traditional command hierarchies. Instead of waiting for Hitler to decide every detail, thousands of officials across occupied Europe independently radicalized policy, confident they were fulfilling his prophecy. This mechanism hasn't disappeared from political leadership. It's been refined and replicated. When contemporary authoritarian leaders make public statements dehumanizing specific groups, calling them invaders, vermin, enemies within, they're creating the same kind of permission structure. They're not issuing explicit orders to commit violence. They're signaling that violence directed at these groups aligns with their will, and subordinates throughout the system understand this as authorization. We saw this pattern in Rwanda in 1994. Radio broadcasts didn't explicitly order Hutus to kill Tutsis. They called Tutsis cockroaches and spoke of the need to cut the tall trees. Everyone understood what this meant. Violence exploded without written orders because the permission structure had been established through public rhetoric. We saw it in Bosnia. Nationalist leaders didn't write memos ordering ethnic cleansing. They gave speeches about Greater Serbia and the threat from Muslim populations. Local commanders and paramilitary groups understood this as authorization and acted accordingly. We see it today in how dehumanizing rhetoric from political leaders leads to violence against targeted groups, with leaders then claiming, "I never told anyone to hurt anyone." Technically true, and completely beside the point. The prophecy as permission pattern reveals how leaders create what they can later deny, how public statements become private authorizations, how systems of violence operate most efficiently when orders never need to be explicit. Here's the truly disturbing insight about Hitler's prophecy. It wasn't a prediction at all. It was a command disguised as a prediction. By framing Jewish annihilation as the inevitable consequence of Jewish-caused world war, Hitler created a self-fulfilling dynamic. He started the war himself, the September 1939 invasion of Poland, then claimed Jews caused it through their supposed international conspiracy, then claimed this meant his prophecy must be fulfilled, annihilation of Jews, thereby using his own aggressive war as justification for genocide. The prophecy didn't predict anything. It created the conditions for its own fulfillment, then used that fulfillment as retroactive justification. This is bureaucratic evil operating at the highest level of sophistication. Hitler announced what he intended to do, framed it as prediction rather than plan, initiated the conditions that would necessitate it, then pointed to those conditions as proof the prophecy must be fulfilled, all while maintaining he never explicitly ordered anyone to kill anyone. And because the prophecy framework made it feel like inevitable consequence rather than policy choice, it reduced moral resistance among perpetrators. "I'm not choosing to murder Jews, I'm fulfilling the Führer's prophecy," became a form of psychological absolution, a way to participate in genocide while avoiding full consciousness of moral responsibility. The prophecy was step 2 in our central thesis about how Hitler ordered the Holocaust through a system designed to avoid written orders. Step 1 was the absence itself, the deliberate choice not to document. Step 2 was the prophecy, public authorization disguised as prediction, creating a permission structure that made explicit orders unnecessary. As 1939 turned to 1940, and 1940 to 1941, and as war made increasingly radical measures possible, Hitler's prophecy hung over every Nazi official like an interpretive mandate. This is what the Führer wants, this is what we're working towards, this is what will prove our loyalty and initiative. No written order was needed. The prophecy was the order. And in conference rooms across Nazi-occupied Europe, officials would begin working towards the Führer, competing to radicalize policy, to solve the Jewish question in increasingly extreme ways, all without waiting for explicit commands that would never come. Working towards the Führer, the system of anticipatory radicalization. October 1939. Hans Frank, newly appointed Governor-General of occupied Poland, faces an administrative puzzle. The German conquest has brought millions of Polish Jews under Nazi control. Berlin has sent no clear instructions about what to do with them beyond vague directives about clearing Jews from certain areas and concentrating them in others. Frank could wait for explicit orders from Hitler about long-term policy. Instead, he tells his subordinates, "We must annihilate the Jews wherever we find them and whenever it is possible." This isn't Frank receiving and transmitting Hitler's orders. It's Frank interpreting what he thinks Hitler wants and radicalizing policy to match that interpretation. This is the mechanism historian Ian Kershaw identified as working towards the Führer, and it's the key to understanding how the Holocaust happened without written orders from the top. The phrase comes from a speech by a minor Nazi official in 1934 who told his staff, "It is the duty of every single person to attempt, in the spirit of the Führer, to work towards him. Anyone making mistakes will come to notice it soon enough. But the one who works correctly towards the Führer along his lines and towards his aim will in future, as previously, have the finest reward of one day suddenly attaining the legal confirmation of his work." This wasn't describing how the system was supposed to work. It was describing how it actually worked. Nazi officials competed to implement what they thought Hitler wanted. The most radical proposals got approved, and success was defined by whether you'd correctly anticipated the Führer's will. Traditional bureaucracies operate through clear chains of command. Superior issues order, subordinate executes order, results are reported, new orders issued. This creates accountability, documentation, and hierarchical control. The Nazi system, particularly regarding the final solution, operated through anticipatory radicalization. Here's how the mechanism worked. Step 1. Hitler establishes general direction through speeches, private comments, and responses to proposals. He doesn't say kill all Jews explicitly, but he makes clear Jews are the enemy, their removal from German society is the goal, and radical solutions are welcome. Step 2. Officials compete to propose and implement policies that align with this perceived intent. The Gauleiter of Vienna doesn't wait for Berlin to order Jewish deportations. He initiates them, then reports what he's done. If Berlin approves, he's confirmed he read Hitler's intent correctly. If Berlin objects, he claims misunderstanding and adjusts. Step 3. The most radical proposals get implemented. When one official proposes deportation and another proposes deportation plus property confiscation, the second gets approved. When a third proposes deportation, confiscation, and concentration in ghettos, that becomes the new baseline. Policy ratchets toward extremism through competitive radicalization. Step 4. Success brings promotion and influence. Officials who correctly anticipate Hitler's desires advance. Those who wait for explicit orders or show insufficient zeal get sidelined. This creates powerful incentives for radicalization without requiring orders. This system was more efficient than traditional command hierarchies because it eliminated bottlenecks and distributed innovation across thousands of officials, all working to solve the problem Hitler had identified without his needing to micromanage solutions. Let's trace how this operated in specific cases. The first example is Kristallnacht in November 1938. Reinhard Heydrich, second in command of the SS, didn't receive written orders from Hitler to organize a nationwide pogrom. But when a German diplomat was assassinated in Paris by a Jewish teenager, Heydrich understood this as an opportunity to work towards the Führer's obvious anti-Jewish intentions. He coordinated with Goebbels, who gave inflammatory speeches suggesting spontaneous German anger was justified. SA and SS units received quiet instructions to not interfere with popular demonstrations. The result: over 1,000 synagogues destroyed, over 7,000 Jewish businesses vandalized, 30,000 Jewish men arrested and sent to concentration camps. When Hitler was informed, presented with it as a spontaneous outburst, he didn't condemn it. His acceptance confirmed that Heydrich and Goebbels had correctly interpreted his will. No written order had been necessary. The second example is the Madagascar Plan in 1940. After defeating France, Nazi planners proposed deporting all European Jews to the French colony of Madagascar. This wasn't ordered by Hitler. It was proposed to Hitler by officials trying to solve the Jewish question in a way they thought aligned with his goals. The plan was impractical. The British naval blockade made transportation impossible. But what matters is the process. Officials felt empowered to develop radical solutions without waiting for Hitler to command specific approaches. When conditions changed and Madagascar became impossible, the same officials felt empowered to develop even more radical alternatives. The third example is mass shootings in Soviet territory in 1941. When Operation Barbarossa began in June 1941, SS Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing units, followed the Wehrmacht into Soviet territory with orders to kill communist officials and partisans. Within weeks, they'd expanded their killing to include Jewish men of military age. Within months, they were killing entire Jewish communities, men, women, children. No written order from Hitler commanded this escalation. What existed was a general understanding that the Soviet campaign was an ideological war where extreme measures were expected, combined with Hitler's prophecy about Jewish annihilation, combined with encouragement when early mass shootings were reported upward. Einsatzgruppen commanders competed to report the highest body counts, demonstrating zealousness in solving the Jewish question. By fall 1941, they'd killed over 500,000 Soviet Jews, all through anticipatory radicalization within a system that rewarded extremism. Why was this system more efficient than traditional command structures? Because traditional hierarchies create bottlenecks. Hitler would have needed to issue orders for each territory, specify methods and timelines, coordinate between multiple agencies, resolve disputes about jurisdiction, monitor implementation constantly. Instead, by creating a permission structure through the prophecy and a culture of anticipatory radicalization, Hitler enabled thousands of officials to independently implement increasingly extreme measures, all confident they were fulfilling his will. It was distributed genocide, crowdsourced evil, where the center set direction and the periphery competed to exceed expectations. This mechanism isn't unique to Nazi Germany. It's how many modern organizations operate, with results ranging from beneficial innovation to catastrophic harm. Consider how tech platforms handle content moderation. Mark Zuckerberg doesn't write explicit orders saying, "Allow hate speech if it increases engagement." But by setting growth and engagement as primary metrics, by rewarding teams whose features increase time on platform, by promoting employees who maximize user numbers, he creates a system where product managers work towards what they perceive as his priorities. Engineers don't wait for orders saying, "Make the algorithm more divisive." They test variations, measure which increases engagement, implement the winners. If divisive content keeps people scrolling, the algorithm learns to show more divisive content. No one ordered this explicitly. They were all working towards the engagement metric. When genocide occurs in Myanmar or Ethiopia, partially coordinated through Facebook, executives can truthfully claim, "We never ordered anyone to enable genocide." And yet their platform's design, shaped by thousands of decisions by employees anticipating what leadership wanted, growth, engagement, scale, created infrastructure that made genocide coordination easier. This is anticipatory radicalization in modern form. Set a goal, reward those who best achieve it, let the system innovate solutions, and maintain plausible deniability about methods. Why did Nazi officials keep radicalizing without orders? 3 psychological mechanisms drove this behavior. Number 1, career advancement. Officials who demonstrated initiative and zealousness got promoted. Werner Best, a legal theorist who developed frameworks justifying radical measures, rose to high positions. Conservative officials who questioned policies got sidelined. The incentive structure rewarded radicalization. Number 2, competitive dynamics. When one Gauleiter reported deporting 10,000 Jews, neighboring Gauleiters felt pressure to match or exceed. Working towards the Führer became competitive. Who could be most Nazi? This competition spiraled toward extremism. Number 3, psychological distance from orders. Paradoxically, the absence of explicit orders made participation psychologically easier. An official who receives a written order saying, "Kill these people," must consciously choose to obey a murder command. An official solving a problem, through evacuation, can tell himself he's being administratively creative, not murderous. The euphemistic bureaucracy, which we'll explore in the next chapter, combined with anticipatory radicalization, allowed ordinary bureaucrats to commit genocide while maintaining psychological distance from the reality of what they were doing. Post-war testimony confirms this pattern repeatedly. At Nuremberg and subsequent trials, Nazi officials consistently described how the system worked. They said, "We received no explicit orders, but we understood the Führer's will." Initiative was expected. Those who waited for detailed instructions were considered lacking. Each success in Jewish policy led to more radical next steps. Competition between regions drove increasingly extreme measures. These aren't defenses. They're descriptions of how the system of anticipatory radicalization actually operated. Here's the disturbing insight that this chapter reveals. The Holocaust happened faster and more completely because explicit orders weren't issued. If Hitler had written a detailed decree in 1941 saying, "Kill all Jews," using these specific methods on this timeline, implementation would have been slower. Bureaucrats would have followed the decree precisely, no more. Legal experts would have debated interpretations. Conservatives would have resisted. Instead, by creating a permission structure through prophecy and rewarding initiative through anticipatory radicalization, Hitler unleashed thousands of officials competing to solve the problem most radically. Each tried to out-Nazi the others. Policy spiraled toward extremism faster than any central plan could have mandated. The absence of written orders wasn't a weakness in the system. It was the system's core innovation. We're now 3 steps into understanding how Hitler ordered the Holocaust without writing orders. Number 1, deliberate non-documentation. He learned from the T4 euthanasia program to never sign death orders. Number 2, prophecy as permission. Public statements created an authorization framework. Number 3, anticipatory radicalization. A system where subordinates competed to implement perceived intent. Each element built on the previous. The prophecy told officials what Hitler wanted. The culture of anticipatory radicalization told them to compete in achieving it. And the deliberate absence of written orders gave everyone plausible deniability. By late 1941, this system had produced mass shootings of over 1 million Soviet Jews. Plans for death camps were being finalized. And the bureaucratic apparatus for continent-wide genocide was operational, all without Hitler having written a single explicit order commanding murder. The machinery was working towards the Führer, and the Führer had made his desires perfectly clear without ever needing to document them. The language of euphemism, how words enabled murder. The 15-page Wannsee Conference Protocol, documenting coordination of the final solution, never once uses the words kill, murder, or exterminate. Instead, it speaks of evacuation, resettlement, special treatment. This wasn't accidental. Euphemistic language was essential to the bureaucracy of genocide. January 20th, 1942. A lakeside villa in Wannsee, a wealthy suburb of Berlin. 15 officials representing various Nazi agencies gather around a conference table. Reinhard Heydrich, second in command of the SS, chairs the meeting. Adolf Eichmann takes meticulous minutes. The purpose: coordinate the logistics of murdering every Jew in Europe. But reading the protocol that survived, you wouldn't immediately understand this. The language is administrative, bureaucratic, almost boring. It discusses evacuation of the Jews to the east, and notes that, in the course of the final solution, the Jews should be brought under appropriate direction in a suitable manner to the east for labor utilization. In large labor columns, with separation of the sexes, the Jews capable of work will be led into these areas and employed in road building, in which task undoubtedly a large part will fall through natural reduction. Let me translate: work them to death on road construction, then kill whoever survives. The protocol never says this explicitly, but everyone at the table understood exactly what natural reduction meant. This is the power and the horror of euphemistic bureaucracy, a named pattern where administrative language disguises atrocity, making participation psychologically possible for ordinary bureaucrats. The Wannsee Protocol is just one example of a systematic pattern. Throughout the Nazi bureaucracy, specific euphemisms replaced explicit descriptions of murder. Let me list the most common ones. Special treatment, in German Sonderbehandlung, meant execution. Resettlement to the east meant deportation to death camps. Final solution originally meant deportation but evolved to mean systematic murder. Natural reduction meant death from starvation, disease, or overwork. Evacuation meant forced deportation. Appropriate treatment meant whatever killing method was locally available. These weren't random word choices. They were carefully selected to allow bureaucrats to process genocide paperwork without constantly confronting the reality of what they were processing. Consider the practical function. A railway clerk scheduling trains didn't write death transport to Auschwitz for immediate gassing. He wrote resettlement transport, destination Auschwitz. A camp administrator didn't file reports saying murdered 500 today. He reported special treatment completed for 500 units. The euphemism allowed each participant to maintain psychological distance from murder. The railway clerk could tell himself he was just scheduling trains. The administrator could tell himself he was processing paperwork. The finance official confiscating property could tell himself he was managing assets. Each individual task, described in euphemistic language, seemed administrative rather than murderous. This is what I'm calling euphemistic bureaucracy, a system where language creates moral distance between action and consequence, allowing normal bureaucratic procedures to process atrocity. Here's why euphemism was essential to Holocaust implementation. Without it, secretaries wouldn't type the memos, finance clerks wouldn't process the paperwork, railway officials wouldn't schedule the trains. Explicit language, load 5,000 Jews onto trains for transport to gas chambers, forces confrontation with moral reality. Euphemistic language, evacuation transport, allows psychological avoidance. The Wannsee Protocol deserves closer examination because it's one of the few high-level planning documents that survived. Heydrich's opening remarks note that he's been entrusted with the preparation of the final solution of the European Jewish question, and that he's received authorization from the Führer for this task. No such authorization document exists, as we've established. But Heydrich's claim served a purpose. It established that this policy had highest level approval, even though that approval was never written down. This allowed the 15 officials at the table to coordinate their agency's participation in genocide while maintaining that they were following proper authorization chains. The protocol then discusses logistics: how many Jews exist in each European country, how they'll be concentrated, how they'll be transported, what will happen to them. And it's all described in language that sounds like urban planning rather than mass murder. One passage discusses what to do with Jews who survive the initial labor utilization. The possible final remnant will, since it will undoubtedly consist of the most resistant portion, have to be treated accordingly, because it is the product of natural selection and would, if released, act as the seed of a new Jewish revival. Translation: the strongest Jews who survive forced labor will be murdered, because they're the most likely to survive and reproduce. But notice the language: treated accordingly, product of natural selection, seed of a new Jewish revival. It sounds almost scientific, evolutionary, administrative. The word murder never appears. Heinrich Himmler, in his capacity as Reichsführer SS, usually maintained this euphemistic language in written communications. But on October 4, 1943, speaking to a gathering of SS leaders in Posen, he broke the silence. The speech was recorded, and the audio still exists, one of the few times a top Nazi official explicitly stated what was happening. Himmler said, "I am referring to the evacuation of the Jews, the extermination of the Jewish people. This is one of those things that's easy to say. The Jewish people are going to be exterminated. That's what every party member says. Sure, it's in our program. Elimination of the Jews, extermination will do it. And then they all come along, the 80 million worthy Germans, and each one has his one decent Jew. Sure, the others are swine, but this one is a first-class Jew. Of all those who talk like that, not one has seen it happen, not one has been through it. Most of you will know what it means when 100 corpses lie together, when 500 are there, or when there are 1,000. And to have stuck this out and accepting cases of human weakness, to have kept our integrity, that is what has made us hard." This speech is remarkable precisely because Himmler abandons euphemism. He uses the word extermination explicitly. He acknowledges what evacuation actually means. He admits that most of you know what it means when 100 corpses lie together. Why does Himmler break the euphemistic code in this speech? Because he's speaking to SS leaders, the inner circle, men who directly commanded the killing operations. With them, euphemism was unnecessary. They all knew. The speech was about hardening them psychologically, praising them for their integrity, and carrying out mass murder without faltering. But even in this unusually candid speech, notice what Himmler does. He frames the murder as a difficult but necessary task that required strength to complete. He's still providing psychological distance, still allowing participants to see themselves as tough soldiers completing an unpleasant duty rather than as murderers committing genocide. The power of euphemism extended beyond written documents into everyday speech. When camp guards discussed their work, when administrators filed reports, when officials coordinated logistics, they used the sanitized language consistently. This created a shared reality where genocide was administratively routine, where processing murder became as mundane as processing any other bureaucratic task. Adolf Eichmann, on trial in Jerusalem in 1961, demonstrated this perfectly. When prosecutor Gideon Hausner asked him about his role in the Holocaust, Eichmann repeatedly insisted, "I never killed anyone. I arranged transportation." This was technically true and completely beside the point. By reducing his role to transportation logistics, by using the bureaucratic euphemism, Eichmann could maintain psychological distance from the fact that his transportation sent millions to gas chambers. The judges weren't fooled. They convicted him. But Eichmann's defense reveals how deeply euphemistic thinking had penetrated. He genuinely seemed to believe that because he personally didn't operate gas chambers, because his role was administrative rather than operational, he bore reduced moral responsibility. This is the ultimate function of euphemistic bureaucracy. It allows participants to fragment their moral responsibility into such small pieces that no individual feels fully guilty. The person who scheduled the train didn't kill anyone. The person who built the camp just constructed buildings. The person who manufactured Zyklon just produced a chemical. The person who guarded the camp just followed orders. The person who operated the gas chamber was just implementing the final step in a long bureaucratic process. Each individual task, described euphemistically, seemed morally neutral or at least morally distant from murder. Only when you assembled all the pieces did the genocidal machine become visible. And the euphemistic language prevented most participants from ever assembling those pieces in their minds. Modern institutions use identical linguistic strategies. Let me give you several examples. In corporate contexts, companies don't fire thousands of workers. They restructure, downsize, right-size, or optimize workforce allocation. The euphemism makes the decision seem rational and administrative rather than devastating to real humans losing livelihoods. In military contexts, armed forces don't kill civilians. They produce collateral damage, engage in kinetic action, or execute neutralizations. The euphemism maintains psychological distance between soldier and victim, between policy and consequence. In intelligence contexts, governments don't torture prisoners. They conduct enhanced interrogation, use stress positions, or apply alternative interrogation techniques. The euphemism allowed interrogators, administrators, and legal officials to participate in torture while telling themselves they weren't torturers. In tech platforms, companies don't ignore genocide coordination on their platform. They have content moderation challenges at scale. The euphemism allows executives to discuss systematic failures as technical problems rather than moral catastrophes. In pharmaceutical marketing, companies don't create addiction for profit. They drive patient adherence and optimize treatment duration. The euphemism allowed sales representatives and executives to push opioids while avoiding consciousness of the addiction crisis they were creating. The pattern is identical to Nazi euphemisms, language that describes harmful actions in ways that obscure their human cost, that fragment moral responsibility across multiple actors, that allow participation while maintaining psychological distance from consequences. When we encounter euphemistic language in contemporary institutions, we should recognize it as a warning sign. Not every euphemism indicates genocide-level evil, obviously. But systematic euphemism, especially when describing actions that harm specific groups or populations, is a red flag that institutions are trying to obscure rather than acknowledge what they're doing. Here's the unexpected connection that this chapter reveals. Euphemism doesn't just hide genocide after the fact. Euphemism enables genocide by making it bureaucratically processable. If Nazi officials had been required to use explicit language, transport 5,000 Jews to Auschwitz for murder in gas chambers, many would have psychologically balked. Secretaries would have refused to type the memos. Railway clerks would have questioned the orders. Finance officials would have objected. The moral reality would have been too stark, too unavoidable. But evacuation transport could be processed routinely. Special treatment could be recorded in ledgers. Final solution could be discussed in meetings. The euphemism wasn't covering up murder. It was making murder administratively possible by allowing participants to avoid full consciousness of what they were doing. This is bureaucratic evil operating through language, words that transform atrocity into administration, that fragment responsibility until no one feels guilty, that allow ordinary people to participate in extraordinary evil while maintaining they just did paperwork. The Wannsee Protocol, with its careful euphemisms and its reference to authorization that doesn't exist, exemplifies this system perfectly. 15 officials coordinated genocide over lunch at a lakeside villa, using language so sanitized that you have to know the code to understand they're discussing mass murder. And when Holocaust historians decoded that language, when they translated evacuation to deportation and special treatment, to murder and natural reduction, to death, the protocol transformed from bureaucratic memorandum into evidence of conspiracy to commit genocide. But during the Holocaust itself, the euphemism worked exactly as intended. It allowed genocide to proceed as administrative routine, processed through normal bureaucratic channels, with each participant maintaining psychological distance from the horror they were enabling. The through-line continues. Hitler ordered the Holocaust without written orders by creating a system where euphemistic language allowed bureaucrats to process genocide without confronting its moral reality. Step 1. Deliberate non-documentation of explicit murder orders. Step 2. Prophecy as permission structure. Step 3. Anticipatory radicalization where subordinates competed to radicalize policy. Step 4. Euphemistic language that made genocide bureaucratically processable. Each element built on the previous, creating a machine that could murder millions while each participant maintained plausible deniability, both legal and psychological. As we move to the next chapter, we'll examine the verbal command chains that substituted for written orders, how instructions flowed from Hitler to Himmler to subordinates without creating documentary evidence, and why this system of verbal authorization was deliberately designed for post-war deniability. The chain of command without commands. Summer 1941. Rudolf Haas, commandant of Auschwitz concentration camp, receives a summons to Berlin. He travels to Reich Security Main Office headquarters, where Heinrich Himmler, Reichsführer SS, receives him privately. What happens in that meeting will result in the deaths of over 1 million people. But no written record of the meeting exists. No stenographer took notes. No memo documented the discussion. What we know comes from Haas's post-war testimony. Haas testified at Nuremberg. In the summer of 1941, I was summoned to Berlin to Reichsführer SS Himmler to receive personal orders. He told me something to the effect, I do not remember the exact words, that the Führer had given the order for the final solution of the Jewish question. We, the SS, must carry out that order. If it is not carried out now, then the Jews will later on destroy the German people. He had chosen Auschwitz because of its good rail connections and because the extensive grounds offered space for measures ensuring isolation. Notice what Haas describes, a verbal order from Himmler attributed to Hitler with no documentation. This pattern, Hitler to Himmler to subordinates, always verbal, never written, repeated across the Holocaust implementation chain. This is our fifth mechanism, the verbal authorization cascade, a named pattern where orders flow through hierarchical channels without creating documentary evidence, maintaining plausible deniability at every level. Why did the Nazi leadership rely on verbal orders for genocide? The answer lies in a precedent from earlier in Hitler's regime, the T4 euthanasia program. Beginning in 1939, the Nazi regime initiated a program to murder Germans with disabilities, what they called lives unworthy of life. The program, codenamed T4 after the address of its coordinating office on Tiergartenstrasse 4 in Berlin, killed over 70,000 disabled Germans through lethal injection and later gas chambers. This program is significant for our investigation because it's the only mass killing program where Hitler's signature exists on an authorization document. On September 1, 1939, backdated to the outbreak of war, Hitler signed a one-sentence authorization empowering specific officials to expand the responsibilities of physicians to be designated by name, so that patients who, after the most critical assessment of their condition, are considered incurable, can be granted mercy death. The euphemistic language, mercy death, disguised murder. But the signature was real, and that signature created problems. Church officials protested. Families of murdered patients objected publicly. The Bishop of Munster, Clemens August Graf von Galen, delivered a sermon in August 1941 explicitly condemning the program as murder, reading from the Ten Commandments, "Thou shalt not kill." The sermon was printed and distributed widely, despite Gestapo attempts to suppress it. The public pressure forced Hitler to officially halt the T4 program in August 1941. The killing actually continued covertly, but the official program was cancelled. And Hitler learned a crucial lesson: never sign orders for mass killing again. Written authorization creates legal liability and provides focus for opposition. This is why no signed authorization exists for the Holocaust. Hitler had learned from T4 that verbal orders provided the same authorization without the legal vulnerability. The verbal command structure for the Holocaust operated through a clear hierarchy. Level 1. Hitler communicated his intent to Himmler verbally, in private meetings over lunch, during long conversations. We know this from Goebbels' diary entries recording Hitler discussing the Jewish question, from Himmler's references to the Führer's order, and from post-war testimony of those present during such discussions. Level 2. Himmler transmitted instructions to his immediate subordinates verbally. Reinhard Heydrich, second in command of the SS until his assassination in 1942, received verbal authorization. Adolf Eichmann received instructions from Heydrich. Camp commandants like Haas received personal summons to Berlin for verbal orders. Level 3. These subordinates implemented policies and transmitted instructions downward, maintaining the verbal chain. Einsatzgruppen commanders received orders during briefings. Camp staff received instructions during orientation. Each level understood the orders must not be documented. The system worked because everyone understood the code. When Himmler said, "The Führer has decided on the final solution," everyone knew this meant systematic murder, even though the euphemism never explicitly said it. When Heydrich told Eichmann to coordinate deportations, both understood the destination wasn't really resettlement but death camps. Goebbels' diary provides the best contemporary documentary evidence of this verbal command system. His entries from late 1941 and throughout 1942 record Hitler discussing the Jewish question with him repeatedly. Let me share several key entries. December 12, 1941, the day after Hitler declared war on the United States. Regarding the Jewish question, the Führer is determined to make a clean sweep. He prophesied to the Jews that if they were to cause another world war, they would experience their own annihilation. This was not an empty phrase. The world war is here. The annihilation of Jewry must be the necessary consequence. March 27, 1942, as deportations to death camps were accelerating. The procedure is pretty barbaric and not to be described more definitely. Not much will remain of the Jews. On the whole, it can be said that about 60% of them will have to be liquidated, whereas only 40% can be used for forced labor. The Führer is the unswerving champion and spokesman of a radical solution. November 18, 1942. The Führer once more expressed his determination to clean up the Jews in Europe pitilessly. There must be no squeamish sentimentalism about it. The Jews have deserved the catastrophe that has now overtaken them. Their destruction will now go hand in hand with the destruction of our enemies. We must hasten this process with cold ruthlessness. These entries establish several crucial facts. First, Hitler was discussing the final solution regularly with Goebbels, always verbally, using explicit language in private that was never used in written documents. Second, Goebbels understood his role as interpreter and amplifier of Hitler's verbal instructions. Third, the verbal discussions were happening parallel to the implementation. The timeline of diary entries matches the escalation of killing operations. Fourth, Goebbels explicitly attributes the policy to the Führer, establishing the chain of command even without written orders. Heinrich Himmler's speeches provide additional evidence of the verbal command chain. His October 4, 1943 speech to SS leaders in Posen, which I mentioned in the previous chapter, includes this passage about authorization. The Führer has placed this difficult task on our shoulders. It is a blessing that the German people received such a Führer who had the tough necessity to make such a decision. Most of you know what it means when 100 corpses lie together, when 500 are there, or when there are 1,000. And to have stuck this out and, accepting cases of human weakness, to have kept our integrity, that is what has made us hard. This is a page of glory never mentioned and never to be mentioned. Notice what Himmler does here. He attributes the task to the Führer. He acknowledges the enormity of what they're doing. 100 corpses, 500, 1,000, and he explicitly states this must never be mentioned, confirming the verbal-only policy. The post-war testimonies of multiple Nazi officials corroborate this pattern of verbal authorization. Let me share several key testimonies. Rudolf Haas, as I mentioned at the beginning of this chapter, testified that Himmler told him verbally about the Führer's order for the final solution. Adolf Eichmann, during his 1961 trial in Jerusalem, testified, "The orders for the physical extermination of the Jews came from Himmler. Himmler informed me that he had received this order directly from the Führer, and that the Führer had charged the SS with carrying out this extermination program." Dieter Wislicini, one of Eichmann's deputies, testified at Nuremberg. Eichmann told me in 1942 that Himmler had received an order from Hitler to physically exterminate the Jews. Eichmann said Himmler had told him this personally. Wilhelm Hodel, an SS intelligence officer, gave sworn testimony that Eichmann told him in 1940 that approximately 6 million Jews had been killed under orders from Himmler, who received authorization from Hitler. The pattern in all these testimonies is identical. Orders attributed to Hitler, transmitted through Himmler, conveyed verbally, never documented. Each witness independently describes the same command chain, the same verbal system, the same understanding that this must not be written down. Why do historians accept these testimonies as proof despite their lack of supporting documentation? For several reasons. Number 1. The testimonies come from multiple independent sources. These men were interrogated separately, often before they knew what others had said. Their accounts corroborate each other on the essential facts: verbal orders, Hitler to Himmler to subordinates, explicit understanding of what final solution meant. Number 2. The testimonies align with contemporary evidence from Goebbels' diary. The timeline matches. The attribution to Hitler matches. The understanding of what was happening matches. Number 3. The testimonies are supported by the physical evidence. Death camps were built. Gas chambers were constructed. Millions were killed. Someone ordered this. The testimonies explain who ordered it and through what mechanism. Number 4. The pattern makes logical sense given the T4 precedent. Hitler learned not to sign death orders. A verbal system provided authorization without documentation. This is exactly what we'd expect a sophisticated criminal to do. Legal systems worldwide accept this type of evidence. Prosecutors routinely convict mafia bosses based on testimony from subordinates who describe receiving verbal orders. The boss never writes it down, is standard operating procedure for organized crime precisely because it creates plausible deniability. Courts have developed evidentiary standards that allow conviction despite absence of written orders. The same legal principles apply to proving Hitler ordered the Holocaust. The convergence of testimonies, the support from contemporary documents like Goebbels' diary, the physical evidence of the crimes, and the logical coherence of the verbal command system together constitute proof beyond reasonable doubt. Modern parallel. This is exactly how corporate executives maintain deniability in white-collar crime cases. When Purdue Pharma executives faced charges related to the opioid crisis, prosecutors found few emails saying push doctors to overprescribe. What they found was testimony from sales representatives describing verbal instructions in meetings, cultural pressure to maximize prescriptions, wink and nod approvals of aggressive marketing. The executive's defense was show me the document where I ordered illegal activity. But courts accepted the testimonial and circumstantial evidence. When Wells Fargo executives faced investigation for the fake account scandal, they claimed no knowledge of the fraudulent practices. But employee testimony revealed verbal pressure from managers, cultural expectations that quotas must be met regardless of legality, systematic ignoring of complaints. The absence of written orders didn't prevent accountability. When Boeing executives faced scrutiny after the 737 MAX crashes, they insisted they never ordered anyone to compromise safety. But internal communications and testimony revealed cultural pressure to minimize costs and accelerate timelines, verbal dismissals of engineers' concerns, systematic prioritization of business over safety. The pattern of behavior proved institutional responsibility despite absence of explicit criminal orders. The modern corporate world has learned Hitler's lesson about verbal authorization. Maintain plausible deniability by never putting the illegal order in writing, communicate through verbal instructions and cultural pressure, fragment responsibility across multiple actors, use euphemistic language when documentation is unavoidable. Here's the unexpected connection this chapter reveals. The absence of written orders actually proves criminal intent. If the final solution was legal and justified as the Nazis claimed, why hide it? Why use only verbal orders? Why destroy evidence at war's end? The elaborate system to avoid documentation reveals consciousness of guilt. Legal actions don't require such elaborate concealment. This is what legal scholars call the consciousness of guilt doctrine, a named pattern where attempts to hide evidence or avoid documentation suggest awareness of criminality. The more elaborate the concealment, the stronger the evidence of guilty knowledge. Hitler's system of verbal-only authorization for genocide wasn't a weakness in the evidence. It's powerful evidence of deliberate criminality, proof that Hitler and his subordinates knew they were committing crimes and designed a system to evade accountability. The verbal authorization cascade allowed the Holocaust to proceed with clear command authority while maintaining legal deniability. Hitler could communicate his will to Himmler verbally. Himmler could transmit orders to subordinates verbally. Camp commandants could receive instructions verbally. And if anyone was ever held accountable, each could claim, I received verbal orders that I couldn't verify, or I never received explicit written authorization. But the system's very existence, its systematic avoidance of documentation, its consistent pattern across multiple witnesses, its alignment with contemporary evidence, all prove it was real. The orders were given. The chain of command functioned. The genocide was authorized from the highest level. The throughline advances. Step 1. Deliberate non-documentation, learned from T4. Step 2. Prophecy as public permission. Step 3. Anticipatory radicalization among subordinates. Step 4. Euphemistic bureaucracy, making genocide administratively processable. Step 5. Verbal authorization chains providing command authority without documentary evidence. By mid-1942, this system was fully operational. Goebbels was recording Hitler's verbal instructions in his diary. Himmler was transmitting orders to subordinates in private meetings. Camp commandants were receiving their assignments in Berlin summonses. Eichmann was coordinating deportations based on verbal authorizations. And millions were dying while Hitler maintained he had never written an order. The machinery of genocide operated smoothly precisely because explicit written orders were absent. Each participant knew what was expected, each understood the chain of command, each could claim they were following verbal instructions from above. And if the war had been won instead of lost, this system would have provided perfect deniability. No signed Hitler order would ever surface because none existed. Each level could claim they interpreted vague directives, that they acted on their own initiative, that they misunderstood the Führer's intent. But the war was lost. The participants were captured. The testimonies were recorded. And the verbal command chain, invisible during the Holocaust itself, became visible in the convergence of independent accounts, all describing the same system, all attributing orders to Hitler through Himmler, all confirming that everyone knew exactly what was happening despite the absence of written documentation. The historian's dilemma, proving genocide without smoking gun. The historical profession faced a crisis in the decades after World War II. How do you prove that Hitler ordered the Holocaust when no signed order exists? How do you establish causation without the traditional documentary evidence that historical methodology requires? This question sparked one of the most significant scholarly debates in Holocaust historiography, a debate that reveals not just how we understand the Holocaust, but how we understand the relationship between leaders, institutions, and atrocity in general. The debate divided into two camps, intentionalists and functionalists. The intentionalist position argued that Hitler planned the Holocaust from his earliest political involvement, that eliminationist anti-Semitism was core to his ideology from the beginning, and that everything after 1933 was implementing a pre-existing master plan. Intentionalist historians like Lucy Davidovich and Daniel Goldhagen pointed to evidence spanning decades. Hitler's September 16, 1919 letter, his earliest known political writing, already called Jews a racial tuberculosis requiring removal. His 1925 book Mein Kampf contained explicit eliminationist rhetoric. His January 1939 Reichstag prophecy announced intention to annihilate European Jews if war came. The intentionalists argued this represented a consistent plan. Hitler always intended genocide, he just waited for opportunity. The functionalist position offered a different interpretation. Functionalist historians like Hans Mommsen and Christopher Browning emphasized bureaucratic radicalization rather than master plans. They argued that no detailed blueprint for genocide existed before 1941, that the Holocaust evolved through failed deportation schemes, Madagascar, Soviet territories, and that policy radicalized through competitive bureaucratic dynamics rather than central planning. The functionalists pointed to the timeline. Serious planning for systematic murder didn't begin until 1941. Deportation schemes were pursued seriously until they proved impractical. The transition from mass shootings to gas chambers represented improvisation rather than blueprint. They emphasized polycratic chaos, competing power centers in the Nazi state, where radicalization emerged from below as much as direction from above. For years, these positions were presented as contradictory. Historians chose sides. Debates became heated, but gradually a synthesis emerged, primarily through the work of Ian Kershaw and Christopher Browning's later scholarship. The synthesis position argues, both were true simultaneously. Hitler provided ideological intent and general direction from the beginning. Bureaucracy radicalized the methods of implementation through competitive dynamics. This is what I'm calling intentional functionalism, a named pattern where directed radicalization occurs within an ideological framework. Here's how the synthesis resolves the apparent contradiction. Hitler didn't need a detailed master plan because he'd created a system where subordinates would develop increasingly radical solutions to the Jewish question he'd identified. He didn't need to order specific methods because anticipatory radicalization would generate options he could approve. He didn't need to micromanage implementation because working towards the Führer ensured officials would compete to exceed his expectations. The Holocaust was both planned, in the sense that Hitler always intended to eliminate Jewish influence and accepted that this might require physical elimination, and improvised, in the sense that specific methods, timelines, and mechanisms evolved through bureaucratic competition and opportunistic adaptation to wartime conditions. This synthesis explains the documentary evidence better than either pure intentionalism or pure functionalism. It explains why Hitler's eliminationist rhetoric spans decades while detailed planning for death camps only emerges in 1941. It explains why failed deportation schemes were pursued seriously. They were functional attempts to achieve intentional goals, while mass murder was always the ideological endpoint if deportation proved impossible. But this synthesis still left the evidentiary question: how do you prove Hitler ordered it without a signed document? The answer is what I'm calling cumulative proof methodology, the same named pattern I introduced in Chapter 1. Let me explain how historians actually establish proof beyond reasonable doubt for the Holocaust. The first element is convergence of independent sources. No single document proves Hitler ordered genocide. But when you have Hitler's public threats, Goebbels' diary entries, Himmler's speeches, subordinate testimonies, Wannsee protocols, and physical evidence from camps, all pointing to the same conclusion, the cumulative weight becomes overwhelming. The second element is elimination of alternative explanations. Could the Holocaust have happened without Hitler's knowledge or authorization? Logistically impossible. The scale required coordination across multiple agencies, consumed significant resources, involved hundreds of thousands of perpetrators. Something that massive, that coordinated, doesn't happen in a dictatorial regime without the dictator's knowledge and approval. The third element is pattern consistency. The verbal authorization chains described by multiple witnesses independently tell the same story. The timeline of Goebbels' diary entries matches the escalation of killing. The euphemistic language in documents aligns with the verbal instructions in testimonies. Everything fits together coherently. The fourth element is logical inference from structure and behavior. The T4 precedent establishes that Hitler learned not to sign mass killing orders. The systematic destruction of evidence at war's end proves consciousness of guilt. The elaborate verbal-only command system indicates deliberate avoidance of documentation. These behaviors only make sense if the participants knew they were committing crimes. The fifth element is the physical evidence. Death camps were built to specific designs optimized for industrial killing. Gas chambers were constructed. Crematoria were installed. Railway infrastructure was modified. Someone authorized this construction. Someone provided resources. Someone coordinated logistics. The physical evidence corroborates the testimonial evidence. The sixth element is the documentary evidence of coordination. The Wannsee Protocol proves high-level coordination of genocide across multiple agencies. Deportation orders, railway schedules, supply requisitions, all document the machinery of genocide even when they use euphemistic language. The paper trail proves systematic coordination, even without the smoking gun order. When you assemble all six elements, the case becomes irrefutable. This is how courts worldwide handle conspiracy cases where direct orders aren't documented. This is how prosecutors convict organized crime leaders. This is how historical methodology establishes causation for events where perfect documentary evidence doesn't survive. The Nuremberg trials established this methodology in international law. The prosecutors faced the same evidentiary challenge: prove systematic criminality without having signed orders for every crime. They developed the concept of criminal conspiracy and criminal organizations. If you could prove an organization existed for criminal purposes and an individual was a member who advanced those purposes, you could convict them even without orders directing their specific actions. The SS was judged a criminal organization. Members could be prosecuted based on participation in its criminal activities even without individual written orders. This legal framework acknowledged reality. Sophisticated criminals don't document their crimes. Systems can be criminal even when individual orders aren't preserved. Participation in known criminal enterprise creates guilt. This framework extended beyond Nuremberg to subsequent trials. The Einsatzgruppen trial prosecuted mobile killing unit commanders based on reports they'd written documenting murders, on testimony describing their actions, on the undeniable fact that hundreds of thousands died under their command. No written order from Hitler was required because the cumulative evidence proved systematic mass murder under their authority. The Auschwitz trials prosecuted camp personnel based on survivor testimony, on physical evidence from the camp, on documentary evidence of deportations and resources, on the logical impossibility that Auschwitz operated without someone commanding and staffing it. No signed camp charter from Hitler was needed because the evidence of what happened at Auschwitz was overwhelming. Modern forensic historical methods have added new evidentiary layers. Digital humanities tools allow analysis of thousands of documents for patterns invisible to earlier historians. Network analysis maps who communicated with whom, revealing command relationships even without explicit orders. Linguistic analysis tracks when euphemisms entered usage, when policies changed, correlating with known events. Timeline correlation matches Hitler's speeches with policy implementations, showing causal relationships. These modern tools consistently support the synthesis position. Hitler provided direction through speeches and private conversations. Bureaucrats radicalized implementation through competitive dynamics. The system evolved toward increasingly extreme measures while maintaining verbal-only authorization at the highest levels. Holocaust deniers exploit the evidentiary gap by demanding impossible standards of proof. They insist on a signed Hitler order while rejecting all other evidence. They claim testimonies were coerced, even when given by perpetrators who had no incentive to falsely incriminate themselves. They dismiss physical evidence as post-war fabrications, even when German wartime documentation corroborates it. They ignore the convergence of independent sources, focusing on gaps while denying the mountain of evidence. This is deliberate bad faith argumentation. When pressed, deniers reveal they wouldn't accept Hitler's signature as genuine anyway, claiming any document would be a forgery. The demand for the smoking gun isn't sincere inquiry, it's rhetorical tactic designed to confuse rather than illuminate. Why does this evidentiary question matter beyond the Holocaust specifically? Because it establishes how we prove institutional responsibility for systematic crimes in the absence of perfect documentation. Modern corporate accountability cases use identical methodology. When prosecuting corporate fraud, environmental crimes, or labor violations, prosecutors rarely have a CEO memo saying commit this crime. What they have is patterns of behavior, testimony from participants, physical evidence of harm, documentary evidence of coordination, and logical elimination of innocent explanations. When Volkswagen executives faced emissions scandal prosecution, no email said, install defeat devices to cheat emissions tests. But engineers testified to verbal instructions, internal communications showed awareness of cheating, the devices themselves were physical evidence, and the scale of the fraud proved it wasn't rogue employees, but systematic corporate policy. When pharmaceutical companies face opioid litigation, no executive memo says create addicts for profit. But Salesforce testimony describes verbal pressure, prescription data proves systematic overprescribing, internal research documents show companies knew about addiction risks, and the epidemic itself is physical evidence of systematic harm. The evidentiary methodology is the same. Convergence of independent sources, elimination of alternative explanations, pattern consistency, logical inference from behavior, physical evidence, and documentary coordination. The absence of the perfect smoking gun document doesn't prevent establishing responsibility when cumulative evidence is overwhelming. Here's the philosophical question this raises. Does requiring written orders for genocidal guilt create perverse incentives? If leaders learn that don't write it down provides legal protection, we've created a system that rewards sophisticated criminals while punishing only the careless ones who document their crimes. This is why understanding the mechanism matters more than finding the missing signature. If we understand how Hitler ordered genocide without writing orders, we can recognize similar patterns in contemporary systems before they escalate to comparable atrocities. The synthesis position, intentional functionalism, reveals something terrifying. Systematic evil doesn't require detailed master plans. It requires ideological direction, structural incentives for radicalization, removal of restraints, and distribution of responsibility. Given these conditions, ordinary bureaucracies staffed by ordinary people can generate extraordinary evil through their normal operations. This is more frightening than the master plan theory, because it suggests the Holocaust wasn't a unique aberration requiring a uniquely evil genius to conceive. It was the predictable output of systems that combined ideological extremism, authoritarian power structures, bureaucratic rationality, and wartime conditions that removed moral restraints. If the Holocaust required a detailed master plan that only Hitler could conceive, it's less likely to recur. But if the Holocaust emerged from system dynamics that can appear in other contexts, then understanding those dynamics becomes urgently necessary for prevention. The historian's dilemma, how to prove Hitler's responsibility without a signed order, was resolved through methodological innovation. The same methods now allow us to identify institutional responsibility in contemporary systems, to recognize warning signs before atrocities occur, to reject demands for impossible documentation standards when cumulative evidence proves guilt. The evidence for Hitler ordering the Holocaust is overwhelming. The methodology for establishing that evidence is robust. The lessons about how institutions commit atrocities while maintaining deniability are urgently relevant. And the absence of that one signed document, far from weakening the case, strengthens it by revealing the sophisticated system Hitler designed to commit history's greatest crime while maintaining plausible legal deniability at every level. The bureaucracy of evil, lessons for recognizing institutional atrocity. The Holocaust killed 6 million Jews through a system where most perpetrators never held a gun, never saw a death camp, never personally murdered anyone, yet all were essential participants. Understanding this bureaucratic genocide mechanism is not historical curiosity. its urgent necessity for recognizing institutional evil before it metastasizes. The system was efficient because responsibility was distributed so diffusely that no individual felt fully guilty. The railway clerk scheduled trains but didn't kill anyone. The camp accountant processed paperwork but didn't operate gas chambers. The chemical company supplied Zyklon B for disinfection purposes but didn't administer it. The camp guard followed orders but didn't make policy. The bureaucrat in Berlin coordinated logistics but never saw the camps. Each participant could truthfully claim they personally didn't murder anyone. Yet the system murdered millions. This is what I'm calling distributed moral responsibility, a named pattern where guilt is fragmented across so many actors that each individual's contribution seems morally insignificant, even though the collective outcome is catastrophic. Hannah Arendt, covering the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem in 1961, coined the phrase banality of evil to describe this phenomenon. Eichmann wasn't a monster. He was a bureaucrat. He followed procedures, obeyed chain of command, filed reports meticulously. His evil came from thoughtlessness, from failure to question, from reducing moral questions to administrative problems. Arendt wrote, "The trouble with Eichmann was precisely that so many were like him, and that the many were neither perverted nor sadistic, that they were, and still are, terribly and terrifyingly normal." This reframes everything we think about the Holocaust. It wasn't committed by uniquely evil people. It was committed by ordinary people in an evil system. This is the terrifying lesson. Normal people, normal bureaucracy, normal administrative processes can generate genocide given the right conditions. The psychological mechanisms that enabled participation deserve careful examination. Let me explain how ordinary bureaucrats participated in mass murder without feeling like murderers. The first mechanism is physical distance. Bureaucrats in Berlin never saw Auschwitz. They processed paperwork in clean offices, went home to families, lived normal lives. The victims were abstractions, numbers and reports, not humans they could see suffering. The second mechanism is temporal distance. The person who issued a deportation order on Monday didn't witness the execution on Friday. The gap between action and consequence allowed psychological disconnection. I scheduled transport doesn't feel causally connected to people were murdered, even though it was essential to the chain. The third mechanism is linguistic distance, which we explored in the euphemism chapter. Special treatment doesn't create the same emotional response as murder. The bureaucrat processing evacuation paperwork can avoid confronting that he's processing mass killing. The fourth mechanism is hierarchical distance. I was following orders from above allows individuals to shift moral responsibility upward. The person at the bottom claims they just obeyed orders. The person at the top claims they delegated to subordinates who exceeded authorization. Everyone has an excuse. Each layer of distance, physical, temporal, linguistic, hierarchical, reduced moral restraint. The cumulative effect was a system where ordinary people committed extraordinary evil while maintaining they were just doing their jobs. This is graduated moral disengagement, a named pattern where multiple psychological mechanisms combine to eliminate ethical barriers that would normally prevent participation in atrocity. Modern genocides have followed identical patterns. Let me trace several examples. Rwanda, 1994. Radio broadcasts gave permission structure, comparing Tutsis to cockroaches that needed exterminating. Bureaucrats organized killing lists. Local officials coordinated massacres. Ordinary Hutu citizens participated in murder. When asked later why they killed neighbors they'd lived beside for years, many said, "It was the job we were given," or "everyone else was doing it," or "the government told us it was necessary." The same mechanisms, distributed responsibility where each person's role seemed small, euphemistic language where work meant murder, hierarchical distance where everyone claimed to follow orders from above, and physical/temporal distance where planning was separated from execution. Bosnia, 1995. The Srebrenica massacre killed over 8,000 Muslim men and boys. The operation was coordinated through military chain of command. No single order said commit genocide. What existed were verbal instructions, cultural understanding of what ethnic cleansing meant, and bureaucratic processes that made mass murder administratively routine. Survivors of the Bosnian Serb forces later testified that orders were deliberately vague, that commanders used euphemisms, that responsibility was fragmented across units, so no one felt fully guilty. The same pattern as the Nazi system. Myanmar, 2017. The Rohingya genocide was coordinated partly through Facebook posts, partly through military communications using euphemistic language, partly through verbal instructions that left no documentary trail. When investigators sought the chain of command, they found the same pattern: distributed responsibility, euphemistic language, verbal authorization, and systematic absence of explicit orders. The pattern appears consistently because it works. It allows institutions to commit atrocities while each participant maintains plausible deniability, both to investigators and to themselves. Modern corporate systems use identical mechanisms for crimes less severe than genocide, but structurally similar. Let me trace several detailed examples. Example 1. The opioid crisis. Purdue Pharma and other pharmaceutical companies created an addiction epidemic that killed over 500,000 Americans. No executive wrote a memo saying addict patients for profit. What existed was a system of distributed decisions that collectively produced catastrophic harm. Sales representatives received verbal instructions to maximize prescriptions, particularly high-dose, long-duration opioids. Bonuses rewarded doctors who prescribed aggressively. Marketing materials downplayed addiction risks. Internal research showing addiction problems was suppressed. Complaints from doctors were ignored. Each decision, viewed individually, seemed like normal business practice. Collectively, they constituted systematic creation of addiction for profit. When executives testified, they used the same defense as Nazi bureaucrats. I never ordered illegal activity. I just ran a business. I followed regulations. The distribution of responsibility across thousands of sales calls, hundreds of executives, dozens of departments meant no individual felt fully responsible, even as the company systematically created addiction. Example 2. Boeing 737 MAX crashes. 346 people died in 2 crashes caused by a flawed flight control system. No executive wrote prioritize profit over safety. But the system generated exactly that outcome through distributed decisions. Engineers who raised safety concerns were overruled by managers focused on timeline. Managers were following directives from executives to minimize costs. Executives were responding to board pressure for profitability. Board members were responding to shareholder expectations. Pilots weren't properly trained because training costs money. Regulators were pressured to expedite approval. Each decision seemed rational within its narrow context. Collectively, they killed hundreds. The investigation found no smoking gun memo saying compromise safety. What they found was a culture that rewarded cost-cutting and schedule meeting over safety concerns, systematic dismissal of engineers' warnings, and fragmentation of responsibility, so extreme that no individual felt personally responsible for safety, even though that was supposedly everyone's job. Example 3. Wells Fargo fake accounts scandal. Employees created millions of fraudulent accounts to meet sales quotas. Executives claimed no knowledge of the illegal practices. But investigations revealed a system almost identical to Nazi anticipatory radicalization. Branch managers received intense pressure to meet quotas with implicit understanding that methods didn't matter. Employees who complained were fired. Employees who met quotas regardless of legality were promoted. The message was clear without being explicit: do whatever necessary to hit targets. This created competitive radicalization, where employees pushed ethical boundaries to outperform colleagues. When the scandal broke, executives insisted they never ordered fraud. Technically true, but they'd created a system where fraud was the predictable outcome of the incentive structure, pressure, and culture they'd designed. The parallels to working towards the Führer are exact. Subordinates radicalize behavior to match what they perceive leadership wants. Competitive dynamics drive increasingly extreme actions, and absence of explicit orders provides deniability for leaders who created the system. Example 4. Climate change in fossil fuel companies. No CEO wrote, destroy the planet for profit. But internal documents from companies like Exxon prove they understood climate risks decades ago, funded denial campaigns, lobbied against regulations, and systematically prioritized short-term profit over long-term planetary survival. The distributed responsibility is extreme. Each company claims to just produce legal products. Each executive claims they just managed operations. Each investor claims they just sought returns. Each lobbyist claims they just represented clients. Yet the collective outcome is an existential threat to civilization. This is bureaucratic evil operating at the largest scale imaginable. No single villain, no explicit conspiracy, just systems designed to prioritize profit over everything else. operating according to their logic, producing catastrophic outcomes while each participant maintains they're just doing their job. The warning signs for recognizing institutional evil before it metastasizes. Warning sign number 1. Systematic use of euphemistic language replacing clear terminology. When institutions start calling harmful actions by sanitized names, enhanced interrogation not torture, right-sizing not mass layoffs, collateral damage not civilian deaths, that's a red flag that they're trying to obscure rather than acknowledge reality. Warning sign number 2. Verbal-only communication on sensitive matters. When decisions that should be documented aren't, when meetings about controversial topics happen off the record, when instructions are given verbally with explicit instruction not to document them, that indicates consciousness of wrongdoing. Warning sign number 3. Distributed responsibility, where no individual is accountable. When asked who decided this, if the answer is always it emerged from multiple departments or many people contributed, or that's just how the system works, that's a system designed to avoid accountability. Warning sign number 4. Working towards culture that rewards anticipatory radicalization. When organizations promote people who exceed guidelines rather than follow them, when competitive dynamics drive increasingly extreme behavior, when subordinates feel pressure to radicalize to prove loyalty, that's a system that will generate harmful outcomes even without explicit orders. Warning sign number 5. Punishment of dissent and reward for extreme loyalty. When whistleblowers are fired, when people who raise concerns are sidelined, when the highest performers are those who never question directives, that creates conditions for systematic harm. Warning sign number 6. Just following orders becomes acceptable justification. When individuals in an institution routinely defend harmful actions by claiming they were obeying superiors, and this defense is accepted rather than challenged, that indicates collapsed moral reasoning. What we must learn from the Holocaust to recognize and prevent future atrocities. Lesson number 1. Demand direct language. Resist euphemism in policy discussions. Insist that institutions call things by their actual names. Force the uncomfortable confrontation with reality that euphemism allows people to avoid. Lesson number 2. Reject just following orders as defense. Nuremberg established this as inadequate justification. Every person has moral obligation to question orders that seem wrong. Bureaucratic position doesn't absolve individual moral responsibility. Lesson number 3. Trace systems, not just individuals. When investigating institutional harm, asking who gave the explicit order is often the wrong question. The right question is what system created incentives and permissions for this outcome. Institutional evil requires institutional analysis. Lesson number 4. Recognize verbal permission structures. When leaders make public threats, dehumanizing statements, or create cultural expectations through rhetoric rather than explicit policy, recognize this as a warning sign. The prophecy pattern Hitler used still operates in modern authoritarian systems. Lesson number 5. Demand documentation and transparency. Paradoxically, the lesson isn't avoid documentation to maintain deniability. It's demand documentation to ensure accountability. Absence of paper trail should trigger suspicion, not provide cover. Lesson number 6. Understand that normal people commit atrocities. Don't assume evil requires monsters. The Holocaust was committed primarily by ordinary people who were good parents, pleasant neighbors, competent professionals. Systemic evil recruits normal people through mechanisms of moral disengagement. Stay alert to those mechanisms in yourself and others. Let me synthesize why Hitler ordered the Holocaust without writing it down, pulling together all 7 mechanisms we've explored. Mechanism number 1. He learned from the T4 euthanasia program never to sign death orders. Written authorization created legal vulnerability and focused opposition. Mechanism number 2. He created a permission structure through his January 1939 prophecy and subsequent repetitions. This provided public authorization that made explicit orders unnecessary. Mechanism number 3. He designed a system rewarding anticipatory radicalization. Officials competed to solve the Jewish question radically, driving policy toward extremism without central commands. Mechanism number 4. He enabled euphemistic bureaucracy, where sanitized language made genocide administratively processable. Evacuation and special treatment allowed participation while avoiding moral confrontation. Mechanism number 5. He used verbal authorization chains providing command authority without documentary evidence. Orders flowed Hitler to Himmler to subordinates, always spoken, never written. Mechanism number 6. He created distributed responsibility, where each participant's role seemed small enough to avoid feeling murderous, even though collectively they murdered millions. Mechanism number 7. He exploited graduated moral disengagement where physical, temporal, linguistic, and hierarchical distance eliminated ethical barriers that would normally prevent participation in atrocity. This wasn't a weakness in Hitler's system. It was the system's core innovation. The absence of written orders made the Holocaust more efficient, not less. It enabled mass participation by ordinary bureaucrats. It created legal deniability for leaders. It distributed guilt so diffusely that individual moral restraint dissolved. Why does this matter now beyond historical understanding? Because every modern institution facing scandal uses the same defense Hitler's system was designed to provide. Show me the document where we ordered harm. Tech platforms say, show me where we programmed algorithms to radicalize. Pharmaceutical companies say, show me the memo ordering over prescription. Financial institutions say, show me the written policy creating the crisis. Governments say, show me the authorization for this abuse. When we accept no written order equals no responsibility, we enable future atrocities. The Holocaust teaches us that the most sophisticated evil operates through exactly this mechanism. Systematic harm without smoking gun documentation. Every time we hear just following orders, we should hear Eichmann's defense and reject it as Nuremberg did. Every time we hear euphemisms for harmful actions, we should hear special treatment and demand clear language. Every time we see responsibility distributed so diffusely that no one feels accountable, we should recognize bureaucratic evil in formation. The document that doesn't exist, Hitler's signed order for the Holocaust, has taught us how institutions commit atrocities. The lesson is urgent because those same institutional mechanisms operate today, hidden behind modern euphemisms, distributed across modern bureaucracies, maintained through modern systems of plausible deniability. Understanding how the Holocaust happened without written orders isn't just history. It's recognition training for identifying institutional evil in contemporary systems before it metastasizes into the next atrocity. The patterns are visible. The warning signs are clear. The mechanisms are understood. Whether we apply these lessons to prevent future horrors depends on whether we recognize that the bureaucracy of evil wasn't a unique product of Nazi Germany, but a set of institutional dynamics that can emerge anywhere ordinary people face pressure to prioritize obedience over ethics, anywhere systems reward competitive radicalization, anywhere euphemism replaces clarity, anywhere responsibility becomes so distributed that everyone feels innocent. That's the final lesson of the Holocaust. Extraordinary evil doesn't require extraordinary people. It requires ordinary people in systems designed to fragment moral responsibility, obscure reality through euphemism, reward anticipatory radicalization, and maintain plausible deniability at every level. Those systems exist today. Recognizing them is how we honor the 6 million who died not through one Hitler's signature, but through thousands of unsigned decisions, millions of bureaucratic acts. A system so efficient at distributing guilt that most perpetrators never felt they'd done anything wrong. Conclusion and sign OFF. The document that doesn't exist, Hitler's signed order for the Holocaust, has taught us more about evil than any confession ever could. It reveals that bureaucratic genocide operates most efficiently when responsibility is diffused, when euphemism replaces clarity, when leaders signal direction rather than sign orders, when ordinary bureaucrats work towards perceived intent without requiring explicit commands. This is the terrifying lesson. The Holocaust wasn't committed by uniquely monstrous people in a uniquely evil society. It was committed by ordinary bureaucrats, engineers, clerks, and soldiers operating in a system that made genocide administratively routine and morally invisible. 6 million Jews were murdered, not by one Hitler signature, but by thousands of unsigned decisions, millions of bureaucratic acts, a system so efficient that most perpetrators never saw their victims die. The absence of written orders wasn't an accident or a historical mystery. It was deliberate design. It was plausible deniability as state policy. It was, in the most horrifying way possible, the genius of evil. How to commit history's greatest crime while each participant claims innocence. When we demand "show me the written order" before accepting institutional guilt, we enable future atrocities. When we accept euphemism instead of demanding clear language, we enable bureaucratic evil. When we allow "I was just following orders" as a defense, we dissolve individual moral responsibility. When we focus on individual monsters instead of systemic mechanisms, we miss how ordinary institutions become instruments of extraordinary evil. Let me be absolutely clear about what the evidence proves. Hitler ordered the Holocaust. He ordered it through prophecies that became permissions. He ordered it through systems that rewarded radicalization. He ordered it through euphemisms that hid murder in administrative language. He ordered it through verbal commands that left no trace. He ordered it through bureaucracies that distributed guilt until no one felt responsible. The evidence is overwhelming. The guilt is absolute. The lessons are urgent. We've traced the mechanism across 7 chapters. We've seen how public threats created permission structures. We've seen how subordinates radicalized without orders. We've seen how euphemism enabled participation. We've seen how verbal chains of command operated without documentation. We've seen how the Wannsee Conference coordinated genocide using language that never said murder. We've seen how historians prove conspiracy without smoking guns. And we've seen how the same patterns appear in modern institutions today. This investigation revealed that understanding how the Holocaust happened matters more than we might realize, because the mechanisms haven't disappeared. They've evolved. They've been adopted by modern corporations, governments, and institutions that learned Hitler's most important lesson. If you want to commit systematic harm while maintaining deniability, don't write it down. Create permission structures through public statements. Reward those who work towards your goals. Use euphemistic language. Maintain verbal-only authorization. Distribute responsibility so diffusely that no individual feels accountable. And when caught, demand critics produce the one document you deliberately never created. The Holocaust happened because Hitler ordered it, not through one signed decree, but through a system more sophisticated than any single order could be. A system that has become the blueprint for institutional evil in the modern world. So what do we do with this knowledge? We recognize the warning signs. When leaders make public threats against specific groups, understand that's creating a permission structure. When organizations use euphemistic language to describe harmful practices, demand they use clear terms. When someone claims, "I never explicitly ordered that," while running a system that produces predictable harm, reject the defense. When responsibility is distributed so widely that no one is accountable, trace the system back to its designers. We refuse to accept absence of written orders as absence of guilt. We understand that the most dangerous commands are often the ones never written down. We recognize that bureaucratic genocide, whether it's killing 6 million Jews or enabling modern atrocities through corporate or government systems, operates through the same mechanisms Hitler perfected. And we remember that ordinary people in ordinary bureaucracies committed the Holocaust by working towards what they thought their leader wanted. We remember that each small act of participation, each bureaucratic decision, each moment of not questioning orders, contributed to the machinery of death. We remember that the document that doesn't exist revealed more about evil than any signed confession ever could. This is the WW2 archives, preserving not just what happened in World War II, but how it happened, so we can recognize the patterns when they emerge again, disguised in modern bureaucracies, hidden behind contemporary euphemisms, distributed across institutions that operate in our name. The Holocaust killed 6 million Jews through a system where leaders maintained deniability, while subordinates implemented horror. Understanding how that system worked isn't just historical analysis. It's survival knowledge for recognizing institutional evil before it metastasizes, before it kills, before we become participants in atrocities future generations will study and wonder how we didn't see what was happening. Remember, the document that doesn't exist is the most damning evidence of all. It proves that Hitler designed a system sophisticated enough to commit genocide while giving every participant, from the Führer himself down to the railway clerk scheduling deportation trains, the ability to claim, "I never explicitly ordered anyone to die." But they did die. 6 million Jews, murdered systematically, and everyone involved knew exactly what they were doing, even as the language they used and the absence of written orders gave them the psychological cover to tell themselves otherwise. Subscribe to the WW2 archives for more investigations into the mechanisms of history that reveal patterns in our present. Because the past isn't dead. It isn't even past. It's the instruction manual that modern institutions consult when they want to commit systematic harm while maintaining plausible deniability. And until we learn to recognize these patterns, until we demand clarity instead of euphemism, until we trace systems instead of just blaming individuals, until we understand that the absence of a smoking gun document often reveals deliberate design rather than lack of guilt, we remain vulnerable to the same mechanisms that made the Holocaust possible. The document that doesn't exist taught us how bureaucratic evil operates. The question now is, will we recognize it the next time it emerges? Will we see the warning signs? Will we demand accountability before millions die? That's the real test of whether we've learned anything at all. This has been the WW2 Archives. Never forget, never again. And understand that never again requires recognizing how institutions commit atrocities, not just condemning that they did.